Thank you very much, and particularly thank you very much both Dorothée and Kadri for the invitation, and thank you very much Ifri for hosting us, and for the participants, particularly that morning on Thursday, to see a very good number of the people that turn up is quite an encouraging news. So that means at least still in Paris there is some kind of interest in the Middle East. In many other places I see that there is a decreasing interest in what is going on because the situation has become quite bleak and discouraging, and that's not a very positive sign to draw people in. So in the Middle East, recently we have seen two trends that is being quite, much discussed about. One of them is, the official defeat of the ISIS has been declared. The Iraq has declared it. The Qasem Soleimani has sent a letter to Khamenei in which he declared that as an humble soldier of him, this is how he described himself. He would like to, express that the mission has been accomplished, that the U.S. and the Israeli plot in the form of ISIS now has been, or Takfiri, has been completely defeated. And this is creating some kind of jubilation, both at some capital in the Middle East, but also in Washington, D.C. as well, too. I mean, recently, for another GMF meeting, actually trilateral strategy meeting, I was in D.C., had the chance to meet many people in State Department or the think tank community or the officials. There is some kind of, feeling there as well, too, that the mission, if it's not completely, but to a great extent, has been accomplished, because now the ISIS, at least in its territorial form, in the Levant or in the Iraq and Syria, because a couple of days ago Dorothée has rightly indicated, while we might see the ISIS in its territorial form that is being defeated in Iraq and Syria, but the ISIS is gaining ground somewhere else. So there is some kind of jubilation that is taking place at some quarter. And this is happening at a time where, the Arab Spring has more or less, did not achieve what it set out to achieve, or it failed, or I don't know, the word fail will be, will be the right word to use, but it's much more appropriate to say it did not achieve. Right now we're talking about, instead of talking about Arab Spring, there is also at some other capital in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, that we are entering a post-Arab Spring period in which the rivalry will be about how to shape the post-Arab Spring period. I think I will be caution a bit about both of them, like the both of these judgments. One of them is the post-ISIS by no means post-crisis in the region. If anything, the post-ISIS period will be actually bringing to the fore the multiplication of the crisis, the multiplication of the grievances, the multiplication of the actors. So we will be perhaps seeing in actually an intensification of some of the rivalry, because now the common enemy that was giving ground for a quite large Western coalition, or what Saudi Arabia has described as the Islamic coalition. I mean, we created some of the very large, at least nominally, maybe not effectively, perhaps some of the largest coalition after the UN. I mean, 60 countries, 65 countries, 68 countries. I don't know the number of the countries that has signed to take part of this
70 or more.
Exactly, anti-ISIS coalition. So all of a sudden we're talking about coalition that everyone was very willing to participate nominally, but very few was willing to take the real work of actually doing the fighting. So therefore, now since the common enemy is leaving the stage, we will be seeing the real issues, because some of the countries, most of the countries, they put aside their real projection, their real political or military projection for the post-ISIS places. And now we will be seeing this. And actually, we saw this, like what has happened in Iraqi Kurdistan was one of the first signs of the post-ISIS crisis. That's, how messy it can get. So therefore, I will caution that, the mission has not been accomplished, And actually much more needs to be done in order not to turn a post-ISIS period, again, in a period which will give foundation to another radical organization of some sort. Some might describe it as ISIS 2.0, or, since Al-Qaeda is not, since ISIS was not the Al-Qaeda 2.0, maybe we can say like a much more updated or a reformed version of the ISIS. But nevertheless, the foundation for radicalism is there. And secondly, the foundation for rivalry that can easily get out of the hand is there as well too. Besides this, we are seeing some trends that was generated by Arab Spring is important as well too, when we talk about the regional rivalries or the regional orders, and question of how to, what kind of order that should appear in the post-ISIS period. I mean, we have to be realistic. No order is going to emerge in the region for years to come, if not decades. I mean, the regional collapse or the regional instability is set to continue for quite some time. But nevertheless, the trend that has been generated during the Arab Spring, some of the major trend, needs to be addressed while we are going for a in the post-Arab Spring period. One of them is how the Arab Spring itself has evolved. I mean, the nature of the Arab Spring is also very much important. What are the questions that the post-Arab Spring regional order should address? One of them is Arab Spring went from being a process of demands to one of the identity struggles. I mean, at early stage during the Arab Spring, there was ideological fault lines. So one can say this was also another identity struggle as well too. But nevertheless, at the early stage in the Arab Spring, we have talked about the demands or the socio-economic grievances of Tunisian men and women, Egyptian women and men, etc. But starting from 2013, 14, 15, we spoke about the Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Arab struggles in Syria, in Iraq as well too. So the question has become not what she or he wants on the Arab Spring. The question has become more who and she is, what identity, what sect, what ethnicity that he belongs. So now we have, a struggling identities, like contending identities. And any post-Arab Spring regional order, which perhaps will come into being like decades from now or years from now, has to address this question. The question, the identity demands of the people, be it Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Arabs, that needs to be satisfied. So unless and until you have it, you will not enter anything. The secondly is how the security sector itself has evolved. Now we are talking about state within the state operating. We are talking about the militia armies in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt even, in Sinai, etc. We're talking about militia armies. And these militia armies are not very easily to be integrated into state structure, because we're talking about, in some places, hundreds of thousands. The number of Hashishabis in Iraq, we don't have the exact numbers, but all we know that it's more than 100,000. And it's well-funded, it's well-armed, and now it has a legal basis. So in a sense, what I call a super Hezbollah, that is being created within the context of Iraq. And you have a militia belt that is going through Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon. And in Libya, how are you going to deal with the questions of the security sector? And the question will be at some stage, how you do it. There should be a balance between integration and elimination. But the question is, what is the criteria that we are going to apply? Who to integrate into the state structure and who to eliminate? And the second question is, are they willing to be integrated? Will they be willing to be integrated? Where I'm not very sure. I don't think that the Hashishabi will be willing to be integrated into Iraqi state structure. While some of them will be and might be, particularly the one that came into being after the rise of the Daesh, the one that came into being with the fatwa of Sistani, that more or less focused on the protecting the Shia religious places in Karbala and Najaf from the ISIS. They were probably is much more likely to come into being, but into the state structure. But will better organization, or with Asabi al-Haq, will be willing to be integrated into state structure? I'm very doubtful, because they were formed prior to the ISIS. They came into being with another geopolitical agenda. It was not, it was not that ISIS that created to their creation. It was something else. And this something else is still there. I mean, the fact that Badr organization was formed in the same year that Hezbollah was formed in 1982 tells us something, tells us about the nature of this organization. Therefore, we have this crisis of the security sector that is very much there, and the trouble that will be facing the regional countries, the international community for quite some time, is how you are going to deal with it. What is the formula? Like, what is the criteria? And even despite finding a formula, finding the right formula to try to incorporate them, if they still resist to be incorporated, which a very significant number of them will, how you are going to deal with them? It is another thing. The thirdly is, the transition. I mean, these things came first into being like as a result of the grievances from the most of the national context. I mean, it had also a regional picture, but nevertheless, the early years of the Arab uprisings, we were talking about a very much nation context, the structure of the nation context, the socio-economic condition in the nation. But later, this process was shaped by regional and international rivalries, and that's why now we talked yesterday about the Sochi, in which there was no Arab leader. In Sochi, 3 leaders met to discuss what should be the future of Syria, with no participation of any single Arab leader. And the evolution of this post-Arab Spring period will be also decided what will be, an acceptable formula or an acceptable status quo for regional and international powers, so they will not start investing as much into their proxies as they do, because, and as a result of these 3 factors, now you have very much fragmented state structure in many places. And previously highly centralized state structure, I don't know to what extent it will be viable in the post-Arab Spring period. I mean, you have the identity struggles in many places. You have very much new security actors in the form of the militia, which is basically in any places that creates very much internal boundaries. I mean, there is very much internal boundaries. And that doesn't tell us that you can really have a very centralized state model. I mean, that's why I'm very much surprised. I don't know what on earth the Americans are thinking when they have been declaring after what has happened with the Iraqi Kurdistan. Well, now we are entering in the post-ISIS period. We're entering in a period where we'll see political stability in Iraq. If anything, I think Iraq is likely to be much more unstable, than it was before, because now you have much more, these militias that got very much animated. They think that they have further legitimacy. One is a result of the fight against ISIS. Another one is to be the force that stopped the Kurdish independence or the Kurdish secessionism. On the one hand, you have this militia that is, gained quite significant momentum. On the other hand, on the top of the Sunni marginalization, you have the Kurdish grievances. And I think you need to be someone in Washington have in a very comfortable chair to say, well, we are entering a very stable period in Iraq. If anything, I think we have sown the seeds of further instability in the region. So this trend that was produced in the post-Arab Spring period is also very much important to keep in mind whenever we have a discussion on the regional order, because unless we discard it, because in my judgment, a centralized state model in the post-Arab Spring period is a recipe for disaster. If you are going to have once again, very centralized Syria, we are only maybe postponing the next crisis for some years, but it's going to strike back. Because after all these grievances, after all this collapse, after all these, identities, I'm a bit doubtful about unless, we really reform the centralized state model in a in a way that can be very, very inclusive, accommodating the difference of different ethnic, religious, other groups within the system, which is not very likely to happen. I don't see how it's going to happen anytime soon. So if we don't do it, if this is not the case, then I think some kind of power devolution is a must for them. But then, while going to talk about the regional structure, another important is what are the new regional blocking that is emerging, the regional alliance structure that is emerging. So the trend that was generated by post-ISIS, the trend that was generated by the Arab Spring, and then what are the, what kind of alliance structure that we have in the region? I mean, broadly speaking, we can talk about tentatively three blocking or the alliance structure, because for some the word alliance is much more applicable, so for some others is not that much applicable. Let's say partnership, blocks, or the alliance. The first one is what I call the authoritarian status quo bloc, which is basically we are talking about Saudi Arabia, we are talking about UAE, we are talking about Egypt, we are talking about Bahrain, we are talking about, to some extent, Jordan. And this bloc has, quite good green lights from Israel and White House America, not the institution America, but the America of Trump and Jared Kushner, and the White House America. And the key figures that seems to be in this alliance is Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. Quite aggressive, driven by regional and the internal fears. It's very reactive, very aggressive. And the constitutive order, like domestically or regionally, the political Islam, by extension Turkey, is the constitutive order of these groupings. And on the other hand, the political Shiism, led by Iran, is another constitutive order of this blocking. The goal is to shape a post-Arab Spring regional order that is once again very much based on the resembling the previous status quo model as well too. In a sense, setting the clock back to 2011, prior to 2011. So to some extent is bringing back the pre-Arab periods to replicate it in the post-Arab period region. And here, because it's driven by very much domestic and the regional fears, because it's very much aggressive, it's also very much prone to committing miscalculations. I mean, miscalculation we have seen within the context of Yemen, we have seen within the context of the Qatari crisis, we have seen within the context of Hariri crisis. Therefore, actually, one of the biggest gifts now I think Iran has is Iran's opponent is Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, I think from now on, when we talk about the source of the Iran's power, we should not just talk about Iran's alliance structure, but also we should talk about who is the opponent of Iran. Who is the opponent of that? Very hasty, very reactive, very aggressive, not very well calculating personalities that is right now forming the anti-Iranian blocs. And I think this is one of the factors that is very much helping Iran. I mean, you have Mohammed bin Salman as your opponent. Ambitious, young, not very well calculating, hot-headed, willing to pick fight very easily, but he doesn't have to be very ready for the fight that he wants to pick. Whereas Iran, you have a much more calculating country, puts structure in place, and knows how to navigate the regional context, know how to navigate the regional, the chaotic environment, the identity wars. So this is one of the strengths of Iran's, I would say Iran's as well too, vis-a-vis that. And here you see also this group very much adopting a narrative of, moderate Islam that was, a terminology that we know in the post 9/11 world. And a terminology for a great extent was applied back then to Turkey. The moderate Islam terminology and the war on terror are the two discourse that is very much adopted by this group. I mean, yesterday you just heard the group now, they call themselves that the anti-terror quartet. Yesterday they just put in some new organization on their terror list, which is burgeoning. So the war on terror, which is a language that we very much recognize from the particularly the U.S. discourse, and the discourse of moderate Islam is very prevalent in the discourse of these groups. And the reason for this is because both it is a PR tool, this terminology, but also it is to some extent reflects an ideological, emerging political or ideological battle lines as well too. PR tools because it appeals to the American audience or the Western audience, the talk of the war on terror, anti-terror quartet, and the moderate Islam. Secondly, when you define yourself as moderates, anti-terror, more or less by extension, you define your opponent as radical and terrorist, etc. And particularly by extension, this is casting particularly the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorist or radical once you describe yourself as moderate and waging the war on terror. Another one, I think right now, perhaps one of another discursive point that will have done the world is this struggle against Shia militia. This is, I think, seems to be particularly in America, the emerging new lines. I mean, Tillerson has referred to it. The Pompeo, the CIA has referred to this. Now, these Shia militants, these Shia militant groups, that is becoming a new talking point, a new version of radicalism. So this, to some extent, this depiction of yourself as moderate Islam is, I think, to some extent, is drawing some lines between yourself and the emerging new language, the emerging new discourse, particularly at some quarters in Washington, in which we'll see more and more depiction of the Shia groups, the Shia militia groups, as radical, as extremist, that is causing quite significant harm in the region. So this is very much, the general feature of this authoritarian status quo bloc. The second one is the Iran-centric, which is much more an identity-based bloc. And perhaps this seems to be, quite a cohesive one. For instance, when you compare this to the authoritarian status quo bloc, this is much more cohesive, whereas the first bloc is actually not that cohesive. I mean, they share some of the common threat perception in which they oppose, but their convergence is not that great. I mean, even on the questions of Iran, they don't see eye to eye. Egypt was not very happy to confront Iran. Egypt was not happy by what was happening in Lebanon. Egypt was not very willing to go along with Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Even Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates is not on the same picture, is not on the same line when it comes to Yemen. So the level of cohesiveness of the first group is not that great, but level of cohesiveness in the Iran-centric bloc is quite significant. It's quite there. And we are talking about Iran. We are talking about Syrian regime. We are talking about Hezbollah. We are talking about Hashishabi militias in Iraq, at least a significant portion of it in Iraq. I mean, Iraqi central government, one can say yes and no. One can say, it can be regarded as part of Iran's regional alliance structure. One can say, no, it's not completely at least. But nevertheless, it has a bloc that seems to be much more cohesive. That seems to be has much more clarity when it comes to the goal that they share. And they have a structure, first and foremost. They have a structure. And they know how to navigate within the chaotic environment. They know how to, navigate through the identity lines, because that's how they were created for sometimes. The condition within which that Hezbollah was born, the condition, the regional or international framework within which that Iran has to navigate since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the condition within which that the Hashishabi is now navigating, led to the accumulation of a significant level of expertise of how to navigate within a region bloc. And this is, particularly now they're centered in Mashriq region or Levant. You see some kind of regional order, a resemblance of regional order or Mashriq order, resemblance of it, not order, that is, very Iran-centric that is taking place. I mean, Iran is the key actor right now in many of these places. It's not the only actor, but perhaps in each context it is becoming the most important actor, is the most significant external players in many of these countries. So this is, this has seems to be, and differently, it has both, as I said, like state and non-state actors as part of this bloc. The third one, what I call is, this Arab Spring, pro-Arab Spring camp, or the political Islam camp, or the political Islam friendly camp, which was mostly Turkey, Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and etc. But when you compare to the first two, this group is gaining more and more the image of a peripheral force. It's not becoming, the real force. It is more and more being pushed to the periphery. And their fate is to some extent is also resemble the fate of the Arab Spring itself. The most Arab Spring has evolved and has, not succeeded and, has taken a significant blow, a setback. And this country's regional ambition also has very much taken a setback. And now you see the downsizing of their regional ambitions, the downsizing of their regional projections, the downsizing of their regional visions. And you can clearly see this in the case of Turkey. I mean, Turkey in 2010-11 would talk about the whole region. When they adopted the discourse would be like, North Africa, Middle East, Levant, Gulf, very centric. It was a very region-wide discourse. Now the discourse of Turkey's regional policy is northern Iraq to northern Syria. I mean, yesterday in the meeting on Syria, the Turkish sold very much, 90% of Turkey's emphasis was what will happen to PYD. The question of what will happen to Syria is a secondary right now. The question is what will happen in the northern Syria. The question is what will happen to the, what will be the status and the role of the PYD in Syria. This is, consuming a very, very, very significant amount of Turkey's time and energy. And as I said, right now, the southern Syria, there is simply no discussion on what will happen in southern Syria, for instance. What will happen, even the fate of Assad doesn't figure much in the discussion. So now we're talking about very, very, these Kurdish areas of northern Iraq and northern Syria. And that's more or less has become them. And the both camp, like this camp, is very much driven by, once again, the national security consideration. This national security language is very dominant. And the political survival. I mean, that was, now how the Qatar has particularly felt after the blockade of the Arab Gulf countries. Whether previously, it's no longer was a Qatar that projected a regional vision, but the question was will be able to, there was more or less, an attempt to regime change in Qatar, or regime suffocating, or regime taming in Qatar. So this group is more or less has been a bit pushed to the sidelines of the regional rivalries. And that's why you see, for instance, this group is trying to a bit recalibrate itself, actually. Right now, the fact that Saudi Arabia and the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is intensifying, some of these groups sees, well, there might be some opportunity there. We might play a different role. We might have a different geopolitical, role at this stage. And they are trying to bring into their fold the countries that is remaining the outside of this Saudi-Iran rivalry. I mean, Kuwait is one of them. You can clearly see, Turkey is very much visiting Kuwait, very much also trying to establish relation with Oman. So in a sense, to have a new, reaching out to new players. But despite this, and at some stage, Turkey also tried to see whether it can play any role of mediation, but it very soon realized that's not possible. So, because regional countries, the one Saudi Arabia and Iran, is not very amenable to this, because to some extent both of them sees as Turkey a part of a camp rather than a neutral country to play a role of mediation. So this was not an option. It soon realized, and that's how you see right now there is a trial of finding a new role which is largely staying out of this neutral thing. So, but Now, what are the topics then? If this is the blocks, what are the topics that will define how the nature of relations between these blocks, and given the trends that was emerged, what are the topics that will define whether we will see escalation or de-escalation between these groups? I think the first one is, the Sunni marginalization in the region, the Sunni crisis in the region. Now you have basically in Iraq, in Syria, up until Lebanon, there is a geographic contiguity of Sunni marginalization, the Sunni grievances or the Sunni crisis. And that's there. And that was, the foundation that gave birth to the, that added fuel to the Al-Qaeda right after the occupation of Iraq, after the, after the constitutions of 2005. And that is very much also that was also very much the political foundation that gave birth to the ISIS as well too. And it's there. It hasn't been solved. So we pushed back ISIS in its territorial form in Iraq and Syria. But nevertheless, the Sunni marginalization, the Sunni crisis, it is political, it's structural, and it's there. So we haven't done anything on this regard. And if anything, particularly, actually the Sunni marginalization is increasing because now their hope in Syria is being completely dashed. And the political process that we very fondly talk about seems to be turned into a process in which the pro-Sunni opposition camp will get the opposition to reconcile with the idea of Assad stay in power with some very symbolic, symbolic concessions that is not really going to deal with any structural or the political foundation of the Sunni crisis. So if anything, I see actually the deepening of the Sunni crisis because their hope in Syria now is dashed. And in Iraq, the political structure that is sustaining the Sunni crisis is there. There is no reform of it. It's there. And I don't see how we are going to, do anything serious on this issue. And there is geographic contiguity between this area of Sunni crisis. And this is providing foundation perhaps for another radical organization soon to emerge. As you know, after Al-Qaeda, we thought that was mission accomplished, and then we got ISIS, and now, like many people, is self-congratulating itself, says like, well, this time is the mission accomplished. I think, soon we'll realize, no, the mission is not accomplished, and the mission will get perhaps even much more problematic because the foundation is there. The secondly is what I call the militia belt. That is another source of trouble that will define, the nature of the regional rivalries or tension. I mean, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, there is a very, geographic contiguity between these militia belts as well too. These militia groups both operate as a state within the state, but also as a transnational network. And that's why you see, Hezbollah jumping to the other side of the border in Syria, doing the fighting there, and then go back to Lebanon. And the same you have with the Hashishabi jumping on the both sides of the borders to do the jobs. So when you think of the nation-state context, it's really weird. I mean, that you have an Iraqi organization that feels, it's very that feels, that is part of the Iranian geopolitical political projection in the region, and can jump on the both sides of the border easily to do some fighting in Syria, and then come back to the Iraq fights against the Kurds, and then do other things, and then you have Hezbollah do the same. This is a very problematic aspect that will, keep the state structure in all these countries weak. There will not be any meaningful functioning state structure until you deal with this question of state within the state. And after a while, perhaps the question will be, who is the state? Who is the state? If the state cannot, if the state cannot enforce its authority on Hezbollah, or if the state cannot enforce its authority on Hashishabi or other militia groups, who is the state? The question of who is the state becomes very significant. For instance, when you talk to the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan after that, it's like, who you should really negotiate. Well, okay, Baghdad is there. But there should be a channel to Najaf. There should be a channel to Najaf. There should be a bargaining with Hashabi, etc. So after a while, the question will be, it's not only a state within the state. The question will more and more gain the color of who is the state. And if state wants, let's say, if Iraqi state tomorrow wants to disarm the militia groups, wants to raid in the militia groups, can it do it realistically? And now you have the legalization of them. They have the budget, a very significant budget. They have the weapon. They have the budget. A very, the modern American weaponry. They have it, and they are gaining more and more political legitimacy, and they are becoming more and more political actors as well too. Political actors with militia groups operating both as a state within the state, but also like across the border as a transnational network, and forming the part of, a regional blocking. And this will very much, draw in competition. As long as this picture is there, we will see, the Saudi Arabia will try to see whether it can create its own proxies. Maybe in Lebanon, down the road, we might see, some countries attempting, if the Sunni forces are not very, the Sunni forces of these countries are not very up to the challenge, maybe they will utilize the Syrian refugees. You have the Syrian refugees living in very miserable conditions, and, if you can, put some cash into the structure and put some, expertise, maybe you can utilize these refugees to operate as militia as well too. So if you don't deal with this question of militia belt, what you are going to end up is the multiplication of the new militia forces. And this, on the top of this, you put the roof of a state, I don't know what it means, really, this roof of the state. If a state cannot enforce its will on a very significant, powerful military and security structure, and if they are very much acting independently. And the third one is particularly related to the Saudi and UAE alliance, is this status of these countries' status anxiety vis-a-vis Iran, and their search for shaping the post-Arab Spring regional order, the fight. The trouble is, they feel that they are punching below their weight. They feel that they are losing, whereas Iran is winning. They feel that they are, they have been too late to the games. And therefore, they're much more prone to the miscalculation. They're much more prone to be more aggressive, to be hasty. And through their actions, they would like to also create a condition within which Israel and the U.S. cannot stay in the sidelines. Israel and U.S. might not like to join their fight, but create a situation in which Israel and the U.S. will not be able to stay on the sidelines. So force Iran into a confrontation in which, the U.S. also be forced to take side, in which Israel also will be forced to take side. Thank God in the latest Lebanon's or Hariri episode, this did not materialize. But that doesn't mean that they will give up on this. I think, if anything, they will be looking for another opportunity in which, force for a confrontation in which that the U.S. and Israel will be drawn into this. And unfortunately, as long as this militia structure, as long as these regional semi-hegemonic projections are there, this will be the temptation of balancing or pushing back or, opposing it will be there as well. It will be in a very aggressive mode. And that might, one mistake sometimes might be sufficient to cause a major conflict as well too. There I'm really worried because any miscalculation can really get out of the hands. Another trouble that I see is we talk about the political process, etc., but the region has a crisis of governance. Before talking about the regional order, we should be talking about the political orders within these nation countries, within the border of each countries. What should be the nature of the governance model or the political order within the context of these states, if there is a very skewed, if there is a very faulty, if there is a very problematic national order or political order or the governance model within the, within this state structure, we cannot have any actually meaningful regional orders as well too. Because to some extent regional order will mimic the domestic order that is in place in many of these countries. I mean, it's not like completely detached from each other. So the region will have to have a discussion on this or have to engage on this issue of the governance model, the political order that will be in place. I mean, in Syria right now, what is the political process? If it's not going to deal with the question of governance in any serious way, if it's not going to deal with the question of political order in any serious way, what is the political process? Is the political process becoming the name of, to get the opposition to accept Assad in a very nice way? Like, what is the political process? So, therefore, there should be a discussion on this governance model that will be, that's. And the fifth one, which I think is very much relevant for Europe, is what we are going to do with the regional Kurds' aspirations. It's there. I mean, in Syria, in Iraq, it's there. And it continues to become a significant source of the friction. And given the importance of Iraq and Syria, you cannot avoid this question. What should be the framework within which that we deal with this question of Kurdish aspiration? And now, particularly in Iraq, it turns into Kurdish grievance as well too. So there should be, some kind of understanding there as well too. Because again, it also has geographic contiguity in Iraq and Syria. It also has a belt. And now this belt is very much also becoming, the number one issue for Turkey. And it's become a very significant priority for Iran. It becomes a very significant issue for Iraq. It will be a major, yesterday, the major trouble in Sochi was between, perhaps the major sticking point was what to do with the PYD, what to do with the Syrian Kurds, like to invite it or not to invite it, or how to accommodate it. So this will be a major trouble, and it is a regional issue. It's no longer just a domestic issue of A country or B country. It's a regional issue. So these are the things that unless and until, these are the major geopolitical fault lines. And until we deal with them and then answer this trends and address the trend that was generated by the Arab Spring, I think the discussion of a regional order will be quite a fancy discussion. And on this, and closing with what's Europe, how to bring the Europe into the picture. And particularly, I'm not going to say much about Turkey because Dorothée is going to, but because Dorothée likes to do the fun part. This will be, I don't know to what extent actually there is a prospect of a major things, but there is the areas in which there can be some work, some work that can be done. One of them, for instance, since it is now a recent crisis, it's affecting, it's a major discussion point. I think the Europe and particularly France can play, and I know that Iran, it had the intention, it did also, publicly declare its willingness to take a quite active role in the disputes between Baghdad and Erbil. Because it's not only a bilateral dispute, this has very, all the ingredients to turn into a bigger than a bilateral dispute. And that's why you see that Iran was on the ground. Qasem Soleimani was on the ground. So it's not just a bilateral dispute. And the fact that right now you have close to 1.5 million IDPs also in Iraqi Kurdistan, a further escalation of tension will create a new wave of internal displacement as well too. Now, at this stage, there is close to 1.5 million IDPs from the rest of the Iraq that is in Iraqi Kurdistan. And that shows, since the Europe was very much concerned about this refugees and the migration, and was willing to sign one deal after another one, I think it should be also very much willing to engage into this Iraq and Baghdad and Erbil negotiation. The fact that the U.S. has completely mismanaged it. Completely mismanaged it. I mean, if you tell me like 6 options from the best to the worst, how to, what option the U.S. is more likely to go, the U.S. went for the number 7, the unimaginable one, the most stupid one. So basically, and now when you talk to them, it's like, how could you be that stupid? I mean, it was clear what was coming on. You only made an alternative offer 2 days, and actually not 2 days, less than 36 hours before the referendum. And it was clear coming. I mean, it was 2014 he declared this in Washington, his intention. And, 2016, the beginning of 2016, he has been talking about this. In June, he set a committee. Set a date, a committee earlier. He set a date for referendum. And you come 36 hours before things. And with with a deal, leave it or take it, and then deal with the consequences. And then, right now, the discourse is, well, now we are in Iraq, going towards, the Iraqi government is gaining strength, and that will be, through Abadi, we will be reducing the Iranian influence, so therefore, another great points. And then Iraq, because the central government is becoming strong, now we have stability. I mean, that is the most ridiculous argument. The reason that you have instability in the last 10, 12 years has been because the Sunni marginalization, the Sunni crisis, the fact that you could not bring Sunni in a working political framework caused you Al-Qaeda's dynamism, emergence of ISIS, and now you have Sunni crisis. If anything is deepening, you have the Kurdish grievances, and the theory in Washington, D.C. is we are going to have stability in Iraq. Wow, that's, perhaps one of the best theory that needs to be perhaps tested. If it works, that means all the logical framework that we are using to analyze the geopolitical framework needs to be revisited. And the secondly is on the question of this stabilization and reconstruction. There, I think that Europe should add the political dimension, because now we are talking about a very technical one. Like, when we talk about the stabilization and reconstruction, we think this just as a construction endeavor. It's not a political endeavor. It's just a construction endeavor. If anything, I think that Europe should bring the political dimension into these debates. Because in Iraq and in Syria, stabilization and reconstruction is not just a construction effort. If anything, this construction effort soon will be destroyed, because there will be another radical organization. There will be another terrorist bombing, and then the aerial bombing, and whatever the money that goes into this process will be wasted. So the stabilization and reconstruction should come with a political framework. And if you don't, then I don't know to what extent it's meaningful just to build a building knowing that the radicalism and extremism will soon come again, and this building will be blown up again. So stabilization and reconstruction should be a political process, not a technical one. And I will leave it here. And
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I suppose you've been as impressed as I've been by this very luminous exposé, because I think it's extremely, at the same time, very comprehensive, complete, and very pragmatical. So it's like it's a mix of good sense and pragmatism, which is, I think, what we need more to understand what's going on in the Middle East and provide forecasts. So I just wanted, as I said earlier, to do a sort of draw a sort of sketchy scheme of how Turkey dealt with the Middle East and the frame in which we should think of its contribution or non-contribution to regional order. But I think I'd like to do a few comments first as a discussant on what Galip said on a few points. Maybe add a few questions or comments. Very fancy discussion indeed. I think the topic that we wanted to focus on today was how Turkey can make a contribution to the regional order. And what regional order? So, there's no regional order possible, as you said, and we're even fueling for more disorder. I don't know if we can have if we have any hand to sort of stop it, to control it at any point. But what I think is very interesting for me, if I have to comment on Turkey, is how what you said resonates about Turkey itself. And this reminds me of the old ontological question of where is Turkey situated? Like, here, in dealing with Turkey, every year we changed the place where we put Turkey in our annual report. 1 year it's in Europe, the next year it's in the Middle East, and it changes almost every year. And I think what you've been explaining now does resonate, about the Middle East, does resonate a lot with what is going on in Turkey internally and about Turkish foreign policy. You talked about the search for identity, insisting on that being the driving force, the main driving force for the Arab Spring, and the main demand that had to be addressed. We have it in Turkey very clearly, in that sort of post-Kemalist era, where the minorities could spring out of the box and express their own identity, and you didn't know how to make cohesion out of this mosaic. Either of ethnic or religious or political identities as well, because Kemalism is also about staunch secularism against Islamism, etc. You talked about the weakness of the state and its difficulty to bring inclusiveness, and I think this is very much the major problem of Turkey these days, clearly, with maybe not, and I would argue about Turkey becoming more or less, going on through the process of a failing state nowadays. I know it's going a little bit to the extremes, but at least it's a very fragmented state structure. So we have at the same time a fragmented society, but also the state structure that is becoming inadapted and fragilized in the post-coup attempt period. You talked about the search for an internal political order and the search for leadership. And in Turkey, we see very strong, maybe not political leadership, personal leadership, but I don't know if it's giving political directions, which is also why everything seems to be, undetermined, because the people don't have an ideological frame to resort to think about their own future. So I think the ultimate personalization of the political frame in Turkey is also detrimental to this quest for sense, for collective sense, clearly. The two points or questions that I wanted to make about your exposé then further, not strictly relating to Turkey, was when you describe the three blocks in the region, I would like to know how you fathom the connections between Bloc 2 and Bloc 3. Because you said that the Bloc 3 at some point wanted to try and mediate between Bloc 1 and Bloc 2, if I understood. And you said that they've been perceived as being part of one bloc in some way. So how do you see them situating themselves in this competition between the two blocks? And can they bring more space, or are we all completely taken in this confrontational framework that is all crushing us, really squashing us, and not giving us any space for political solutions, political creativeness? The second point was your making the point again and again that the marginalization of Sunnis as a political force is one of the main difficulties for the region. And I'm more interested in the diversification of the Sunni landscape, as we discussed in Brussels 2 days ago. And I think Sunnis are being in power in many countries in the region at the same time, so this cannot be denied. But maybe they would not characterize themselves as Sunnis because, for instance, clearly in Egypt, in the internal fight between the Muslim Brotherhood and the post-Muslim Brotherhood state, Sisi doesn't want to define himself, especially as a Muslim actor or an Islamist one, but still it's a Sunni power. So we have a whole diversity of styles, identities of the Sunni camp inside the Sunni, which is what is more interesting for a political analyst, I think, because this brings also resources for the future. Because this is where you have, radicals, but also progressive people, and discussion or fights, internal fights between them, but you have potentialities for evolution, and that's very important. And this is also what fascinates me about Turkey nowadays. I think it's the country where you have the wider spectrum of Sunni Islam political actors. And we've seen it also in the post-coup situation with the Gülen against AKP thing. We have all sort of radicals inside Turkey, including some Daesh leaders who've been fleeing after the Mosul retaking by the Iraqi forces. You have only, practicing Muslims, then you have seculars, but who live in a country which is 99 point whatever Sunni Islam, or probably Sunni because we don't know where to put the Alevites, and they have not searched to this identity quest very clearly in Turkey yet. So I think in Turkey this is one of the most interesting things is how the dialogue works between these different factions, and I think this will shape very much the future, also the stability of the state in the future. Because in some way you could define Turkey today as the Muslim Brotherhood state of the future, in some way, because it's been sort of tamed everywhere, as you said, and you don't know. This is what may arise from Turkey or not. The third question is about the state and how you've described the weakness of states and the difficulties for the institutions of the state to impose any order on societies, on fragmenting communities that don't want to come together, that fighting against the state. And at the same time, you started by advocating for decentralized states. So this is, of course, a very difficult transition, institutional organization to move forward to. Because someone could say that the institution of a federation in Iraq is what has made Iraq stay together in some way until, this referendum. But we don't know if Barzani was about to declare independence. Had everybody, not rushed to sort of deny the referendum itself. It was not that clear either. So what makes people come together in the region? We had that surprise in Lebanon with the sort of false move of Mohammed bin Salman, who just brought together, to all our surprise of everybody, the Hezbollah becoming the number one supporter of Hariri to prove that it was not plotting against him, and the Christians and the Sunnis and the Shias and everybody coming together to the defense of the Prime Minister, which was quite a surprise. But it meant that Turkey, even if it's not maybe an expression of a national identity, at least wanted to say that it was a country. We have to be respected as a country, not maybe as a nation. We don't know, the difference between state, country, and nation maybe should be gone into with more sophistication. I don't know. But I think we need very much to think about what makes these states, even if they're weak, stay in place. I mean, they're still there. And they're dysfunctional, but not completely collapsing. I mean, I'm not talking about Syria, but I mean, in Iraq, in the post-Mosul period, somewhat could advocate that it was quite a victory for Abadi, who managed to reinforce himself in the political landscape. He was very weak. You said, and I quite agree, that in the end, the disaggregation forces are very strong. But, it's still there. So what does this make work, and until when can it work before it collapses? So that was all the discussion and comments, and now I'll be very quick because, again, I want to go to the discussion with the audience. So my next point were about Turkey in the Middle East as seen from the West, from a French or Western perspective, and should we consider Turkey as a winner or a spoiler in the Middle East, to make it short? We know that the Middle East is the place where probably interest meets between Turkey and the West currently, and at the same time it's the place where most difficulties arise in the dialogue and the trying to work between the American, EU and Turkey bloc. And as we're in this GMF frame, there is a very big effort to bring this sort of trilateral discussion as about where to come together, how to cooperate on issues. And we can identify the Middle East as the place where we come together and we fight between ourselves because we disagree on interest, solutions, etc. So My 3 points are that Turkey definitely has become a big player in the Middle East over the last decade. Second point, Turkey is acting as a spoiler in the Middle East currently. Third point, Turkey is affected by the Middle East to the point that it may weaken it as an actor. Turkey is an important player in the Middle East. We don't need to explain that in depth, but we've witnessed the return of Turkey, of Turkish foreign policy in the region, very strongly over the last decade as a result of Ahmet Davutoğlu's grand vision of foreign policy, the replacing of Turkey at the center of international affairs, and the using of new tools in foreign policy, with Turkey developing itself as a soft power, contrary to the image it had previously. I think the Turks have been very creative, very pragmatic in their looking at the region for some time. They've managed to impose themselves as a mediator in so many conflicts. They have gone beyond some of their taboos, and the previous alliance with the KRG was clearly one great example of Davutoğlu's creativeness and performing into bringing something new and a fresh new impetus in Turkish foreign policy. And we all know that the acme of Turkish influence in the region came with the Arab Spring, and which was also the beginning of the difficulties for Turkish foreign policy. So that was the acme and the starting of the falling of the Turkish status and resonance in the region. As seen from France, as we think of ourselves as a major player in the Middle East traditionally, we had many difficulties to accommodate Turkey's rising in the region. We saw it with delay. And to my mind, the idea is that we do still work quite closely with Turkey on some issues and some files, show also that we have not understood the difficulties that Turkey is facing now in its handling the Middle East. So it's like we are always a little bit delayed, and we've taken advantage of the fact that the Turks wanted to be on the forefront for every issue, and especially in Syria. We've been watching Turkish efforts, trying to accommodate them, and maybe at some point misunderstanding the difficulties that the Turks had to make sense of the Syrian pictures. And the Kurdish issue, again, is a very clear case in point. Like now, everybody has so many difficulties to understand why the Kurds are the only problem at the top, and almost the only problem, as you said, on the agenda of Turkey, referring to Syria. Second point is Turkey becoming spoiler in the Middle East, probably because you had contradictions between the grand ambitions of influence of Turkey that wanted to use in the post-Arab Spring period the channels of the rising Muslim Brotherhood types of parties in the region, and this didn't work. And the national objectives of Turkey and its national obsessions, like Cyprus is not exactly in the Middle East, but it has become again also a sort of difficult block on the obsessive list of priorities for Turkish foreign policy. The Kurds, of course, the ethnicization of the Turkish foreign policy with its constant reflex to work only with the Turkish constituency or communities, and to bring Turkmen rebels everywhere, and to try to build Turkmen's political parties in Iraq or in Syria. And then Turkey focusing more and more on its narrow objectives, which made, in the end, in my sort of very caricature terminology between winner and loser, it's on a sort of intermediate path between the two. And can now Turkey make a difference in the region? This is the question that everybody has to address in the post-coup attempt of 2016, because the general appraisal is that Turkey is sort of overestimating its own capacities to influence the region, to act in the region. It's still producing a grand discourse, but it doesn't have the capacities to impose it. And the main difficulty for me is that Turkey has to move from a soft power perspective to a hard power perspective. It has not worked intensely on this shifting frame of work, and it has not finalized the reconciliation between the military forces and the political power in Turkey. That became so clear in the 2016 with this coup attempt that in the end nobody expected, but everybody was talking about. It's like, in Turkey everybody speaks about the possibility of a military coup all the time. Nobody believed in it, and then it happened, then it failed. But it still means that we're in this sort of intermediary period where you didn't have the full reconciliation between the two blocs, and this is absolutely indispensable if you want to become a power now in the region, because handling the region is about intervening, committing yourself in conflicts, becoming a military actor as well, which has been, by the way, a demand of the West to Turkey for very long. Whether we speak about Iraq or Syria, there has been for very long a sort of pressure for the Turks to intervene as a NATO ally, as being on the forefront of this geographically, to be a military actor. And there is a big difficulty for Turkey to perform this role that we've been wanting. But at the same time now, Turkey itself, the Turkish leadership has understood that it's necessary. And this is probably what triggered the decision for an intervention in Syria 2 months after the coup attempt, which surprised everybody because nobody thought that the Turks had sort of recollected their forces and they were in grade of doing anything that would be working to the end in Syria. Turkey, the fact that I call Turkey a spoiler is, of course, has to do with the way they consider their alliance and their behavior in the two main working frame where the West and the Turks come together, namely NATO and the EU. And we all know that the Turkish succession process to the EU is now completely stalled, and that we are going into more and more political difficulties, whether at bilateral levels between states, especially Germany and Turkey, but also at an EU level. The accession process is really in danger at present, and I think the difficulty lies on both sides, not only on the EU, but also on the constant Turkish declaration towards the behavior, the attitude, and the way the Europe handles situations are, I think, displaying much too much aggressiveness to ease the tensions. And within NATO, of course, Turkey's sort of efforts to strike a balance with Russia for its own, the sake of its own interest, have been perceived as extremely detrimental to the cohesiveness of NATO, which is already a structure that has difficulties to bring about new objectives, to position itself as a consistent force in the region. And Turkey is not perceived currently as a very reliable ally for NATO. The caricature being, of course, the incident that we've witnessed in Norway and that Mark has reminded us. So my third point quickly is about Turkey being affected by the crisis in the Middle East. So how did this crisis, and of course we think mainly about Syrian crisis and the Turkish involvement in the Syrian crisis, but Iraq is also a case in point. The rising tensions between the new U.S. administration and Iran is also a new case, but also the GCC crisis of December is another point of pressure for Turkey. Turkey is now acting in a very, very tense neighborhood, and it doesn't really necessarily have the capacity to handle it. But then all the crises in the region are affecting Turkey economically first, because it had a lot of trade going on with the region, but also now it's becoming a sort of a dire need for to fund its growth, because Turkey is not is a country it's not a rich resources rich country, and it needs external funding, which came majoritarily from the EU, which now comes partly from Gulf countries. So the handling of the Saudi versus Qatar quarrel this summer was also very important in economic terms of Turkey. The second way the crisis are affecting Turkey is the demography, and I think it's very important that you raise again the point of the IDPs in Iraq and in the Iraqi Kurdistan, because we see that IDPs and refugees and the Syrian refugees have become a political asset for most of the governments. I mean, it's a liability, of course, because it destabilizes country, it weakens governance, etc. But also, at some point, it's becoming a political asset for some governments. And who knows what the future of the 3-4 million Syrians inside Turkey? Who knows? You know, there have been this background debate on whether they should acquire Turkish nationality. Are they going to be Turkified? Are they going to stay Arabs inside Turkey? Will they be a sort of balancing between the two countries? And the third point is, of course, security, with the rise of terrorism and Turkish involvement, military involvement in Syria, raising the level of tension inside Turkey itself, because all the constituencies that are fighting in Syria are also present in Turkey, and which is becoming an internal problem. And we have seen in Turkey the sort of race between the extremist discourse internally and the foreign policy. I mean, the way foreign policy is being handled in Turkey is partly because of the domestic agenda and bringing, more support to the AKP leadership that's being challenged precisely, probably because it's been weakened by all the difficulties that Turkey is facing externally. So there is a very negative, vicious circle, I think, between the domestic policy and foreign policy inside Turkey. My conclusion is just to ask, of course, very conventionally again, is Turkey creating order in the region, or is it not just exporting this order, which has been my point for a few months, exporting this order in the region, but also exporting this order in the EU, inside EU countries, through the social engineering of the Turkish diaspora. And I will finish there.